The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff. America's inner cities continue to be plagued by crime, poverty, and failing schools, despite decades of government social programs and private philanthropy. Are uninvolved parents part of the problem? Are churches and other urban community groups doing enough to ensure the success of the next generation? To find out, Policy Watch is joined this week by Hugh Price, former president of the Urban League, former editorial writer for the New York Times, and the author of Achievement Matters, Getting Your Child the Best Education Possible. Now, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Hugh Price, welcome to Policy Watch.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You were active in anti-poverty efforts in the New Haven area in the 60s and 70s. What were you doing there? What did you do?
I started out as a legal services lawyer representing people who couldn't afford their own attorneys. And in 1967, riots broke out in New Haven, as they broke out in a number of other cities. And I became the head of a group called the Black Coalition of New Haven, which was designed to try to promote economic development in some of the riot-torn areas and also to promote healing, racial healing within the community.
Should I ask how that worked out?
I think it worked out reasonably well. I think New Haven managed to put the fabric of the city back together. New Haven has faced all of the challenges that many northeastern and midwestern cities have faced with the deindustrialization of their urban core and outmigration of people and jobs and retailing and that kind of thing. So New Haven has had lots of challenges, but I think we overcame the initial racial tension that had drawn people apart.
I think when we talk about New Haven, I think it is the case that New Haven received more anti-poverty funding per capita than any other city in the nation?
Yeah, New Haven was in the forefront of promoting urban renewal. The mayor at that time, Dick Lee, believed passionately in the future of cities. I think he probably ripped down too much of the core of New Haven in order to try to build a new New Haven. But it was tough with even with the federal aid coming in to overcome the impact of the loss of thousands of jobs at Winchester, Repeating Arms, and other industrial plants in the city. So people who had been able to live in the heart of the city, walk to jobs that paid good incomes, found that those jobs moved to the suburbs or overseas, and it was very difficult for government to overcome that.
Now, this is always an unfair question. If you knew then what you know now, would you have done anything different in those years?
In New Haven professionally? In New Haven. I don't think so. You're always limited by what you know at the time. I think we were trying to figure out a formula to get the city back on its track financially. One thing we did do when I was in city government is that we and other cities chased the one company that had announced it was going to move. So cities from all over the country would be in pursuit of the one that was going to move. You hope to land it, and there'd be one winner, and everybody else would be a loser. What we didn't do enough of was analyze the natural assets of the city and figure out how to build on those natural assets rather than chasing the one elusive company that might move.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I think that has been a losing strategy on the part of cities and states as well. I was at a meeting once with Governor of New Jersey, and I don't know whether it was the Giants or whoever were threatening to leave, and they wanted a bigger stadium. And she said, okay, let them leave. Where are they going?
Right. Well, they're going to go. They may go nowhere. They may go somewhere. But the key is to try to build on the base of entrepreneurs that you have in town, the natural economic assets and other assets that provide fodder for growth. And I think a lot of successful cities have figured out how to do that.
Well, you left New Haven and then you went to the New York Times.
Yeah, in 1978, I was approached out of the blue by Max Frankel, who was the head of the editorial page, and he asked whether I wanted to consider becoming an editorial writer for the Times, and I was so ignorant about the function of newspapers that I asked, was this a group that got together every few months to talk about the overall policy? And he said, no, it consists of writing editorials, and it was a dazzling opportunity and the first career move for me that took me out of New Haven to the Big Apple, and I started in January of 1978.
But in terms of the social or political topics that you covered, what are the areas that you're most
I wrote
happy?
about urban policy. Well, interestingly enough, I went to work to write about urban policy, and then we had the strike in the summer of 1978. Jimmy Carter had announced an urban policy just before our strike. By the time we got back, it had dissipated, so there was nothing to write about there. But I wrote about criminal justice, education. I took over the education beat from the great Fred Heckinger. I wrote about telecommunications policy, about the time of the deregulation of the cable television industry. And so it was those kinds of issues, employment and labor issues. It was basically urban-oriented and related to the needs of minorities, and probably the telecommunications area is the only outlier.
Yeah. Could you feel your editorials having an impact?
Yeah, I did. You know, it was a very heady experience to be able to write editorials.
How old were you?
I was 37 when I took the job. I do remember when at one point I had written about 10 editorials on the same subject, and I was getting a little bored. I went in to see Max and said, you know, surely I ought to move off this subject to some other. And he said, you know, you've got to keep writing and writing if you believe that we ought to take a position on this issue, because what makes you think anyone read any of the 10? What made you think that even if they had read them, it affected the way they think about them? And if it did affect the way they think about it, what makes you think that they have acted on those positions in ways that you think are appropriate? So go back and write 10 more. And when you think about it, that's the essence of advertising policy. If you really want to impact behavior, you have to bombard people with the same message. It's boring to do it, but it takes a while to get people's attention and hopefully to influence the way they think about issues.
And then you left the Times and went to the Rockefeller Foundation.
No, I went to public television. I had a wonderful 6-year career in public television at Channel 13 in New York, where I ran the division that produces great performances in Nature and American Masters and the travel series and Art of the Western World. And we were just coming off of having produced Civilization and the Jews and the Brain, and I took over right after that period and had a wonderful 6-year run, 4.5 as the head of the production division. Got to travel all over Europe doing co-production deals. It was wonderful.
That was fun, huh?
And then it was the Rockefeller Foundation,
where we met.
Right.
And was it called the Urban? What was your portfolio? You were vice president?
I was vice president for urban affairs and also basically for education. I devoted a lot of my energy to focusing on education issues, trying to support the efforts of people like Dr. James Comer, who's a wonderful school reformer who believes that education is part of the overall development of children. Probably the most unexpected but gratifying experience was proposing to the National Guard that they create a youth corps, for a domestic youth corps for kids who had dropped out of school. I brought that idea to them in the spring of 1989, and they bit, and that conversation in the spring of 1989 became the National Guard Youth Challenge Corps, which was started in '92 and exists to this day, and it's a wonderful program. And about 70% of the kids, all of whom are dropouts, who go through the program are coming out with their GEDs, their high school diplomas, getting jobs and going to community colleges. And if you were to Google it, you'd find about 30 or 40,000 entries there. So it was a wonderful experience.
Well, that's fabulous. In fact, I visited one of those programs in suburban Maryland,
right.
And they took us into the dormitory, and all the cots were made, you know, regulation folded over and everything was spotless. And I said, how many weeks does it take you to train the kids to do this? And they said 2 days.
Well, you know what interested me about the idea of the military, and I never served. When I grew up in Washington, D.C., in New Hampshire Avenue and Park Road, and when I was growing up here, I remember fellas who were in school with me who we call knuckleheads. Anybody remember knuckleheads? These guys that sort of didn't act right and maybe a little thuggish. They would drop out of school. I'd see them a couple of years later, and they were ramrod straight. They had joined the Army, and something had turned them around. And I figured if we could capture that experience, it would be very powerful. And so what happens in the Challenge Corps for these kids is that they teach them leadership, which you'd expect, but they also teach them followership. How to function in a larger organization where you've got a supervisor, a boss, a customer that you have to serve, and how to do that without feeling that your dignity is compromised. And they get the kids ready for academic performance as well. So it's a very, very powerful experience for youngsters.
And from there to the National Urban League.
National Urban League, the job of a lifetime.
Now, in some respects, how do I say this? The National Urban League is well known, but in some respects it's eclipsed by the NAACP and so forth. So National Urban League established in 1910?
National Urban League is the oldest and largest community-based movement empowering African Americans to enter the economic and social mainstream. It was founded to help people who had migrated from the South to America's cities get jobs, find good housing, overcome discrimination, etc. It is the agency that focuses on the needs of real people right before your eyes who need to make the transition to the mainstream. So urban leagues are very complex, community-based organizations delivering direct services to people and involved in advocacy and policy work as well.
And in terms of advocacy and policy work, I think the most well-known publication of the Urban League is the State of Black America.
State of Black America was started about a generation ago under Vernon Jordan's leadership, and it's an annual analysis, research-based analysis of the condition of African Americans in this country.
Now, I know I should probably ask this question of the current president of the Urban League, but how is the State of Black America?
Well, it is. I hope you will have Mark Mariel, my successor, on. Sort of rock and steady. The African American community continues the move into the mainstream. There's been growth in the size of the African American middle class. We've got substantial numbers of kids in higher education. But we have major issues. I mean, far too many of our young people in schools, particularly in urban schools, are not achieving at the levels that are necessary. Far too many kids are not reading as well as they should. Far too many young people are involved and caught up in the criminal justice system, and the AIDS phenomenon is very robust in parts of the African American communities. So we as America are a work in progress, and we're making a lot of progress, but there's a lot of work still to be done.
As you know, a few weeks ago, Bill Cosby opened either a public debate or a can of worms.
Right. Both.
Both. What he said, I just wanted to not overstate or understate what he said. One line was, the lower economic people are not holding up their end of this deal. These people are not parenting, they are buying things for kids, $500 sneakers for what, and won't spend $200 for Hooked on Phonics. I won't ask you beyond what you just said, but much of your work has been around this issue, right?
Well, let me just say, I think Cosby had a point. He said it in a way that was very blunt and caught a lot of attention. 3 years ago, I gave a keynote address at the annual Urban League conference in which I called for a development revolution, in which we get our spiritual houses in order, we get our values in order, that rap stars begin talking to kids about education rather than dysfunctional behavior, that we mount a campaign for African American achievement, that we make sure that we bring no child into this world unless we're prepared to support and parent the children. I called it time for a development revolution. I didn't get the kind of attention that Bill did by saying some of the same things in his way. He had a very serious point that he was trying to make, and on substance, he's right. Unfortunately, he said it in a way that galvanized attention. That's the way the press works these days, and hopefully it will contribute to some soul searching within our community, which is already underway. I mean, you see Sean Puffy Combs announced just the other day that he's going to be involved in a major effort to get out the vote. I would hope that Sean Combs would get up before young people in the suits that he now wears and tell children he wants them all to read so they can read Raisin in the Sun, which he just acted in. As we see the maturation of the hip-hop community taking on these kinds of issues, I think we will begin to move the attitudes of our children in a constructive direction. I'd also say that the out-of-wedlock birth rate among black teenage girls is at a 40-year low? I mean, very striking. So the kids are getting the message as well, and that's very encouraging. If they can get the same message around education and achievement that they've gotten around out-of-wedlock birth rates, we'll make tremendous progress.
Well, and in fact, in terms of out-of-wedlock birth rates, it was always the case that the African American community had the highest rates. It is now the case that Hispanic Americans have as high or a higher rate, depending on how you count the numbers. Well, you tried to put this in a positive framework, as you mentioned, and I think you called it culture of achievement.
Right. At the Urban League, we launched a campaign to promote academic achievement. We created a National Achiever Society to induct kids who've gotten B averages or better in school, in rituals of induction that occur in churches. And we'd have 1,000 parents out there supporting 350, 400 kids who were inducted. We called it our National Achievement Gang, with its own rituals of induction, its own credo, its own colors.
You gave them jackets.
We gave them jackets. It was wonderful. It was a ceremony, you know, an honor society ceremony in high school would last about 45 minutes. These would go on, because it was in a black church on a Saturday afternoon, a little bit longer, like 2-3 hours. And it was wonderful. I think we can even call and raise that. I mean, I once made a suggestion to Mayor Bloomberg that we ought to have in New York City a parade down Fifth Avenue for every child who passes the New York State exam in reading, and let them march with their parents and their school teachers. We should have parades down Main Street in every community in this country for the kids who are getting it done academically, so that they become our 21st century heroes. And not just the kid who's the valedictorian, but every child who is achieving, because we've got to encourage all of the kids to want to be achievers.
Is that why you wrote Achievement Matters?
Yeah, we had learned so much from our work in promoting academic achievement. We learned so much from Scholastic, about magazine, our partner, about what parents can do to help their children become good readers. And I had learned so much as I like to tell young people, a retired kid, that we bundled up all that information into a book that was written for parents and community organizations and pastors, saying to pastors, you know, why don't you just make sure that every child in your church becomes a good reader? We could lick this literacy problem.
And in fact, a great deal of this book is directed to parents.
It's written for parents. It's not a policy wonk book. It is for parents and grandparents who are raising children. It's for the heads of organizations like pastors who have families and children in their flock. My view was that if we can get everybody who's got their arms wrapped around children, who share responsibility for raising children, to do the simple kinds of things that can be done, and to get engaged in the schools, we can help propel our achievement forward.
Now, you mentioned Jim Comer and the Comer schools, and there's an echo of that in this book, isn't there?
Oh, yeah. Jim Comer is a remarkable man. He's a psychiatrist up at Yale Child Study Center who's worked for a couple of decades now in the schools and trying to help children achieve, and also get parents deeply involved in the schools. And it's Jim's belief that education is a facet in the development and maturation of children. You can't just focus on education alone. The schools and the parents should be partnering to focus on the healthy development of children. And when my wife and I were much younger and our children were much younger, our eldest daughter attended one of Comer's schools right after he started. As a matter of fact, we lived across the street from the Martin Luther King School in New Haven, where Jim Comer was working, and we became devotees of his philosophy very early.
And the program was tremendously successful in New Haven.
Right.
But it hasn't been as successful in
Well, it's been successful in a number of places and not in others. It depends on how much the adults apply themselves to the job of developing children. If schools are dysfunctional and they have all sorts of other organizational issues there that the adults in the building can't get to these, you know, the development of the children, then the school's not going to function well. Where there's very close collaboration between parents and the educators, it's been successful.
But what makes the difference in those schools? What makes one school ready to adopt either Comer's approach or your approach, or just involve parents and so forth, and another school or another school system not?
Well, I think it's a function of the leadership in the schools and the school systems, whether the principals are on the page, whether the principal has enough relationship with the faculty in that school to want to take a constructive approach, or whether the principal and the faculty have sort of given up the ghost, don't believe in the kids, don't trust one another, don't function together well. And we all know that there are organizations that become dysfunctional. And sometimes at the school district level, there's so much going on, so much politics with the school board, that it's hard for the central administrators to focus on the core mission of education. So a lot of it turns on the readiness of the adults in the building to focus on this method, or there are many others that are quite successful. But it depends on whether the adults are up to the enterprise.
Bill Bennett was on this show recently, and it took a while for me to get him to say, yes, and the unions have been a problem too.
Oh, sure, the unions are a major issue. All the adults in schools that aren't functioning well are part of the problem. School boards that focus on Contracts and hiring instead of focusing on the core enterprise are a problem. Unions that are very protective of their turf, very protective of contract terms are part of the problem. I gave a speech at the National Press Club a few years ago in which I called for all public schools to be converted into charter schools, in which I meant that we should set performance standards for public schools and say, we expect you to get, let's say, 3/4 of the children reading at grade level, at least 3/4 of the children reading at grade level. If you do that, we'll give the teacher and the principals a lot of space to decide how they're going to do that. They can decide on the curriculum, the textbooks. They can decide how long the school day will be, etc. But if you fall below that, then we're going to really have to intervene, and we may even retract the charter or the contract that you have to operate. That's a direct threat to the way teachers' unions function now because of the protections that they enjoy. But I think we ought to pay teachers a lot more than we do now, so that we attract many, many more people into the profession.
Would you pay? There's a key point here. Would you pay all teachers or the new teachers?
I think
make distinctions?
Starting salaries for all teachers should be a lot higher than they are now. I think starting salaries for teachers should be in the vicinity of where accountants start, where young lawyers start. I mean, within reason. We work in New York City, and we have 3 daughters who've lived in New York City. I know exactly where the salary level is between your children have to call home for help with the bills, and when they don't have to call home. And when New York City took the starting salary up to about $38,000, they just barely crossed that threshold. But adults who are starting into the teaching profession still have to either live at home or live with strangers. To share space. That's not going to attract a lot of people. It attracts the true believers and the Peace Corps types, but it doesn't attract the numbers of people, capable people, that we ought to be attracting into the profession. So I would pay them a lot more. Then I'd say the quid pro quo for being paid like a professional is that you have to give up a lot of the protections that professions don't enjoy. They don't enjoy lifetime tenure. They don't enjoy control over the hours, that kind of thing. It's about the success of the enterprise for the children. So I think we ought to pay people like professionals. We ought to give those who run individual schools a lot more operating room, hold them accountable for their performance, and withdraw the permission to operate if it's not successful.
We talked about involving parents. And I think one of the biggest challenges doing parental involvement wholesale as opposed to retail, right, instead of parent by parent or school by school. There isn't anything, I think, in the No Child Left Behind legislation about parents that I know of, is there?
Well, it encourages parent engagement, and I know Secretary Page is very interested in this, but that's really a responsibility of the community.
Do you think?
Yeah, I don't know how you program that. There isn't enough money in the world to get parents to be as involved as they have to be. I think, and the whole point of this book is that if we're really going to lift the achievement levels of the kids, the schools have got to do their job, and we've been talking about that. But the churches and the fraternities and the sororities and the organizations and individual parents have got to rise to the challenge as well. And it's hard for me to imagine, as a veteran of the anti-poverty days of trying to reprogram people's heads, whether there'll ever be enough programs and enough public money to do that on the scale that's required. I do think, though, and I do believe, for example, that if the pastors of churches throughout cities would proclaim that all the children in their church are going to become good readers, and if they paired up the parents who are struggling with the retired postal workers in that church who've been reading addresses all their lives, we might be able to make a difference. If the churches would have literacy days where, just when I was growing up, we had the science fair days and everybody had to do a science project, the kids would do a literacy project, we could crack that. If the fraternities and sororities out there that are on the ground in the communities would get very involved, I think we could help solve this problem. So I think we need a mobilization at that level that should not wait for a government program.
Well, that's very appealing. It sounds very appealing. And of course, the problem with it being a government program is we'd hit this faith-based separation of church and state.
There's another problem called huge deficits. I don't know where the money is going to come from in this day and age.
But you sat in a position of power at a foundation, and it's also the case that private philanthropy is not particularly supportive of this either.
Well, I think private philanthropy is involved. There's just not enough of it. I mean, there isn't enough private philanthropy to go out and mobilize hundreds of thousands of parents in city X, Y, or Z. And I do believe that that's part of the obligation of the organizations that comprise a community. That's part of what the village's function is about. So we've got to get the churches and all of the organizations that comprise the village very involved in this challenge. I think it's doable. Where it's happening, it's very compelling. I have no question that we can do it, and I think the challenge is to ignite the energy and the interest. And just as, I mean, think about the reduction in the out-of-wedlock birth rates. That wasn't a result of government programs focused on reprogramming the kids' heads. The kids got it in response to various stimuli, value stimuli, probably the signal that you're not going to be able to make a life on welfare, change in federal policy. But the kids got it, and they changed their behavior, and they're the better for it, and our society's the better for it. We need to find a similar combination of factors that will change the children's attitudes about achievement.
And I know from your life story, you've been working on that for many years. On that note, Hugh Price, thank you very much for being on Policy Watch.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.